Welcome everybody to another episode of Talk Globally, the podcast on international politics from the Sir Eta Alpha Honor Society here at Webster Vienna Private University. Today is special in many regards. First of all, it is special because this is our first video edition, but even more so because we have Dr. Sean McFate here with us today. I don't know even where to start. Maybe I should start by saying that he's a professor at Georgetown University and the National Defense University in the United States. He was part of the US Army, a contractor. He is a best-selling author, writing books such as The New Rules of War or The Modern Mercenary. He did his graduate studies at Harvard, his PhD at the London School of Economics. So an incredibly impressive resume. Thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And we will talk about various subjects today. Your research, of course, focuses very much on mercenaries and private military companies. So for people who do not know a lot about this topic, could you explain a little bit what is a mercenary today and what role do they play internationally?
Sure. So mercenaries are basically what everybody thinks they are. They're armed civilians who fight in foreign wars chiefly for profit. And there's been volumes of academic ink spilled on whether mercenaries are different than private military companies. But ultimately, there's really no difference. There's really no fine line. If you can be one, you can be the other. And sometimes countries and clients use the term private military company cynically. So in the United States of America, during the Iraq War, they hired Blackwater. And they called it a PMC, a private military company, even though most of the world looked at Blackwater as mercenaries. And today, Russia calls the Wagner Group a PMC, even though the rest of the world views them as mercenaries. The important thing, though, is that mercenaries have been gradually returning to international relations since the end of the Cold War. And governments around the world have never taken them seriously enough until maybe this past summer in 2023, when the Wagner Group marched on Moscow and threatened Putin, and then Prigozhin, sort of the owner of the Wagner Group, was assassinated really by Putin.
Let's say the timing was suspicious.
Yeah, 60 days later, his plane blew up in the air. And the thing is that mercenaries are gradually privatizing warfare, and should this trend continue, then someday, ExxonMobil can have its own military, Elon Musk can have his own military, and that will radically rechange international relations as we know it.
Since you were mentioning the Wagner Group, I actually have two questions on this. First being this march on Moscow. I think it was the 23rd June of this year. What do you think was that? Was that a mutiny? Was that an attempted coup? Or was it something completely different?
Well, most in the media and the quote-unquote expert classes have termed it a mutiny. Some think it's a coup, but it's actually none of those things. This is a renegotiation. This is traditionally how mercenaries renegotiate a contract. There's no court of law to sue in. So it's renegotiation by force and treachery, whether it's, this past year or it's 800 years ago. So, and also when Prigozhin was assassinated, that's another form of renegotiation by the client. So this, treachery is the watchword of private warfare. Because again, it's all transactional. There's no courts of law to peacefully deal with conflicts. So it becomes this form of treachery, mistrust, assassination, coups. It's something that Machiavelli warns us about in The Prince in 1513.
What is also interesting, I think, is that Putin, even after this, the renegotiation, as you pointed out, even now they are using mercenaries still. The Wagner Group is both heavily used in Ukraine, but also in many African states, right? Why do you think Putin is using mercenaries? What is the rationale?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it is remarkable that Putin still uses mercenaries after the humiliating and the destabilizing march on Moscow in June. And it shows you their importance, not just for him, but in modern warfare. The reason why he keeps on using them is because they do important things for him. So in Ukraine, they are ways to disguise the costs of war to Russian citizens in, St. Petersburg, Moscow, and core Russia. Russians do not like seeing their sons coming home in body bags, but they don't care about mercenaries. And so by relying on mercenaries, and let's not forget there's about 50, or it used to be about 50,000 50,000 Wagner mercenaries in Ukraine. That allows him to continue the war there and not risk too much upheaval domestically. Africa is a completely different situation. The mercenaries in Africa are the old guard of Wagner. These are not felons dumped out of jails, murderers and rapists. These are the original sort of Wagner group, some of them are ex-special forces, ex-paratroopers, ex-army from around the former Soviet Union. They are professional. In terms of mercenaries with training and lethality. And, since 2015, the Wagner Group has become the Kremlin's weapon of choice to spread Russian influence and hegemony across Africa and parts of the Middle East. And, they're creating client states for Russia. And Putin needs that. And also they provide gold, for example, out of places like Sudan and Mali to fund Putin's war in Ukraine. So these three reasons are why Putin is not relinquishing mercenaries.
And what about this concept of plausible deniability? That is also a big part of it, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, yes. So mercenaries offer plausible deniability, not just to Putin, but to any client these days. And plausible deniability is key if you want to fight and win wars in a global information age. It allows you to take bigger risks, and if it goes badly, you don't have to associate yourself with it. So, for example, and ultimately mercenary is the ultimate plausible deniable asset because you can just disavow them. So, for example, in 2018, in eastern Syria, about 300 to 400 Wagner Group mercenaries, quality ones, ran into American Special Operations Forces in Kashan. And that night, the Americans killed more Russians than any night during the Cold War. But the reason it didn't go to World War III, like, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, is because both Washington and Moscow invoked the plausible deniability of those mercenaries. They both agreed, there's no need to escalate. We'll just say, nothing to see here. And, of course, if that was a Russian infantry unit or a Russian Spetsnaz unit, Putin would have to respond to appease the Siloviki, at least. The Siloviki are the heads of the Russian security institutions who work for Putin, and they would want blood. But because it was just Wagner Group with plausible deniability, they avoided World War III.
Groups like Wagner, of course, also have a horrendous human rights record. So do many governments as well, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. I just wonder, is there a way for us to regulate these private military companies? If not by international law, maybe by market forces.
Sure.
In the end, they have commercial interests.
Right.
If you make it their commercial interest to behave in a certain manner, maybe that is a way that, for example, the United States, which relied quite heavily in Afghanistan and in Iraq on private military companies, maybe that's a way to regulate them.
Sure. Well, this should be one of the primary questions right now of the international community. We have a growing mercenary world. It's not just Russia, it's all over the world. And how do we control it? How do we prevent, because remember that private warfare, it's a form of warfare, Mercenaries are incentivized to start and to elongate armed conflict for profit. And when they're in between contracts, they become bandits, marauders, extortionists, racketeers. Also, because of the plausible deniability, clients hire mercenaries deliberately to skirt international law. So how does international law wrangle this problem? And I think this is the core problem. I think that there is a group, for example, that's trying to do this. It's sort of like an NGO supported by the Swiss government, located in Geneva. It's called the International Code of Conduct Association, and their members they're both NGOs, some states, and members of this industry. They are not mercenaries, and not everybody who is an industry member. Some of them just do like logistical support in, like fixing aircraft or something. But some of them do armed security, and they sign up to this humanitarian human rights code of conduct. They have transparency, they're audited, and they want to, this group are trying to create this norm, right? But unfortunately, it's not enough because, again, the reason you hire mercenaries is to do the things that you don't want your own military caught doing. Like what Nigeria did in 2015 with Boko Haram, the Islamic terrorist group. Boko Haram had abducted 300 or so schoolgirls to turn them into wives, right? To rape them and produce families. And this is not the first time Boko Haram has done this. And the Nigerian military, which is not an insignificant military in West Africa, finally the president of Africa said, we're going to hire mercenaries and they're going to work with you, and we're going to force Boko Haram out. And they did in weeks. After 6 years of this problem, they did it in weeks. And one reason I think they use mercenaries is to skirt international law, to do things that you don't want your soldiers, caught on an iPhone doing. There's no evidence of this, but I've talked to people. So what can we do to curtail this? You can try to use market power. So when you're, look at the Iraq-Afghanistan war. The United States of America held a monopoly on the market for force. A monopoly is simply where you have a big client and multiple, suppliers. It's like a monopoly of client and a sugar daddy. And the United States could have used its market power to pick winners and losers based on, for example, human rights observance and so forth. The United States did not do that. It didn't even keep a unified record of who they were hiring. So the Department of Defense would have a bad experience with one contractor. That contractor would then go to the State Department and get a new contract. There was no sort of even internal accountability or track record. So there was no sort of the invisible hand of the marketplace going to have accountability. So that's one way, though, is maybe if the United Nations started to hire members of the International Code of Conduct Association to help augment peacekeeping, which the UN needs to do. It doesn't have enough blue helmets. But the United Nations Department of Peacekeeping sets up, here's our code, we're going to have transparency, auditing, here's our standards, and we're going to monitor it. That could create, and we're going to reward companies that abide by it and bankrupt, frankly, companies that don't. Because if you have market power, it's like Amazon. You can bankrupt people. And so you need a big supplier like the United Nations. The United Nations is gradually privatizing more and more of its operations, but it's not privatizing, trigger pulling. So maybe they should consider doing that. It would help them with peacekeeping operations like in the Congo, and it would help regulate this market in a sort of de facto way. Now, there are others who think that we need better international law. And I am very skeptical of this. First of all, we don't have good international law, which is probably surprising to some of your viewers. The best international law we have comes from 1977. It's one of the protocols of the Geneva Convention, and this deals with mercenaries, but it is so restrictive yet so ambiguous that anybody can wiggle out of it by saying they're fighting for the cause. That's all I have to say. I believe in the cause of my client. They don't say client. I'm fighting for the cause. I'm a freedom fighter from a different place. That's all. And then you're out. They can't. But even if we had better international law, who's going to go into Ukraine and arrest all those mercenaries? Not the United Nations, not the EU, not NATO, not the United States, or Libya, or Yemen. And even if we did have somebody to do that, mercenaries can shoot your law enforcement dead, which makes regulation very difficult, which is why mercenaries are the second oldest profession. They've only disappeared kind of as a freak accident in world history in the last 200 years, last 150 years. The last mercenaries were around 1850, and privateers. And in 1850, they all sort of disappeared. I mean, they gradually disappeared from 1648 to 1850. And now they're re-emerging. And what we're seeing today is the world going back to normal. Private warfare was normally how wars were fought, whether it's the Old Testament, the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, popes hired mercenary armies. It's just today that it seems weird, but actually, in the course of history, this is normal.
And that brings me to my next question, actually, because what you're of course seeing behind of all this is a change in the international order, in the global order.
Yeah.
And that's what you're also describing in your book, The Modern Mercenary.
Yes.
What you describe as neo-medievalism.
Yes.
Could you elaborate a little bit on that? What do
Sure.
you mean by that? What do you see on the horizon?
Yeah, so we all grew up in a world, we were all in grade school, where we're taught that states are the basic geopolitical unit of the world, of world order. International law is all between states. Only states have the privilege of waging wars. We live in a state-centric world. And whether you're a political scientist or you're a member of the United Nations or a diplomat, that's how you see the world. I mean, Washington, D.C., the bureaucracy there is about states. But in truth, states are not timeless and universal. They are kind of a creation of what happened after the 30 Years' War in Europe, from 1618 to 1648. There was a Treaty of Westphalia, well, it was a Peace of Westphalia. It was two treaties, as you know. And without going into details, the next 200 years saw the gradual states taking over international relations, because before the 30 Years' War, throughout all of history, states, the world stage was crowded. It wasn't just a certain type of actor like states. There were empires like the Roman Empire, but there were also religions. There were, the Pope in the Middle Ages was a sort of a superpower. There were city-states like Venice and Florence in the Middle Ages. There were, the Templar Knights that were, sort of like they were everywhere, and they worked in a network. There were powerful aristocratic families like the Habsburgs across empires, consolidating empires by battle or by marriage. And so in, say, the Middle Ages, you had what we call fractured sovereignty. You had you would have a peasant, like peasant McFate, a serf, right? And I wouldn't answer just to one boss. I had the Duke, who had a set of laws, but I also had the bishop, right? And then they answered to the Pope, and they answered to the Emperor, but none of that was clean. There was a lot of internecine debate, fighting, political, and you had overlapping authorities and overlapping allegiances, and it made the medieval world very messy. It was what we call fractured sovereignty. Today, in the last, say, 150, 200 years, we've had state sovereignty, a state-centric system. And what we're starting to see since the end of the Cold War is sort of a return to pre-Westphalia, of states eroding, not disappearing, And you're seeing, like in Afghanistan, if you look at it, they have multiple identities, multiple allegiances, multiple authorities. They may be first from a certain village, and then they may be from an ethnic group. I'm Pashto. And then maybe third or fourth, I'm an Afghan. But that is third or fourth. And we see this throughout, of course, the Middle East, Shia, Sunni, what parts of are you from, what tribes, it's very tribal. Sub-Saharan Africa was arguably never Westphalian. Its boundaries were dictated in the 1880s in the scramble for Africa by European colonialists. In fact, many of the boundaries of these places in the Middle East, Sykes-Picot in 1916, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Durand Line, which is put in place there by the British Empire, these don't reflect natural polities on the ground. These are imperial boundaries. So many parts of the world, also Latin America, were never fully Westphalian states, and now they're eroding, and they're becoming and that's making the world more what I call neo-medieval. And now, especially since we have mercenaries back, anybody who's rich enough can become a superpower, just like the Habsburgs, which was a family. It wasn't a state, right? They took over a state in an empire, but or whatever. I mean, Geneva was a city-state with an empire, as was Venice. We're seeing this type of thing return. And if we look at the 20th, sort of what I like to say is that the 21st century is looking more like the 12th century than the 20th. It's becoming neo-medieval. Not everywhere in the world. I think, Europe, North America, East Asia, some other parts in between are strong Westphalian states, but we can't look at the global world order anymore and say it's Westphalian. I think we have to look at it as pre-Westphalian, and I call that neo-medievalism.
In such a world where sovereignties are fragmented and where you have them overlapping, how do you think does that change warfare? Is the Clausewitzian way of war, interstate, established on certain norms, based on gaining more territory,
right,
is that something of the past?
I think it largely is, with some exceptions. Remember Clausewitz, who was, kind of molded in the Napoleonic era, which was his book on war really describes Westphalian way of war. A Westphalian warfare, right? Interstate, fought with professional militaries who work out political grievances like gladiators. And in war, war is seen as the failure of peace in Clausewitz, which is how diplomats view it today. And you declare war, you do things in war ethically that you would never do in peace. And we will maybe perhaps see this in the Gaza Strip, where Israel, as of today, has not moved in. I think they will, and they're going to do things there ethically that are not permissible in time of peace. And then once somebody loses, there's a peace treaty. They agree to it, and it goes back to peace. But wars don't work that way anymore. The United States of America, the last time it declared a war was in World War II. It's been at war in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, but those are not official wars. There's been no peace treaty with, say, the Taliban. And there's not going to be like a USS Missouri moment. Like the end of World War II for the United States was on the battleship Missouri with the Emperor of Japan signing an armistice, right? You're not going to have moments like that. And wars today are not fought between militaries, they're fought between paramilitaries. Terrorism, insurgency, the laws of armed conflict, which are set to regulate what we call conventional war or Clausewitzian warfare, nobody observes them anymore. In fact, they're exploited. And that's what Hamas has been doing. That's what the Taliban does. That's frankly what Russia does. And so wars of territory like World War II, World War I, and interstate wars in general are pretty much obsolete. If you look at data sets like the Norwegian one, PRIO, you'll see that interstate wars since 1945 to today are kind of like a flat line on the bottom, disappearing, and other types of wars, irregular war, genocides, you name it, are just keep on rise. And in fact, there's nothing more unconventional today than a conventional war. Yet our strategic communities, our national security establishments in various world capitals like Washington, like NATO, are still, mired in the past. There's a saying that generals like to fight the last war they won. For NATO, that's World War II. They're still thinking in terms of tanks and aircraft carriers and fighter jets, which have very little utility in modern war. I mean, if you look at Putin's blitzkrieg against Ukraine in 2022, it didn't end in 3 days. He didn't take Kyiv in 3 days as he predicted, as a lot of Western pundits and it also predicted. It was beaten back by Ukrainian irregular war, guerrilla units with Javelin anti-tank missiles, beat back that blitzkrieg, not a counter blitzkrieg. And now Ukraine is fighting a conventional war against Russia. Their so-called spring offensive that started in summer and still going on in the fall, and they've been unsuccessful. I mean, all those tanks, all those Bradley fighting vehicles it's like the Somme, the Battle of the Somme in 1916 in World War I. A lot of destruction, a lot of death over maybe a few kilometers. That's not winning. And I think there are other strategies they could have pursued, Ukraine could have pursued, that are more, say, Sun Tzuian, less Westphalian, that could have been much more successful. For example, how do you turn the Wagner group against the Russian army? There are ways to have done that. We didn't have to wait for it to naturally occur in June of 2023. We could have done that maybe in January of 2023 and exploited what comes out the other end of it. To remove a whole army from the battlefield would have been much more productive for Ukraine than trying to fight through barbed wire and mines with tanks. So I believe personally that we live in a post-conventional war era because we're living in a post-Westphalian era, and conventional war is the Westphalian way of war, and we don't live in that type of world anymore.
And in this post-conventional war era, I mean, you already gave one example. What do you think should the United States, European governments do since war changed, as you said?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it doesn't make sense to invest any more billions of dollars into aircraft carriers,
right,
submarines and tanks.
Yeah.
What are the strategies you think they should pursue?
Well, first let's talk about this. This conventional war is not just, it has many names: regular war, symmetrical war. It's, whatever you want to call it. It looks like World War II, World War I. It's the Clausewitzian way of war. We're stuck in this early 20th century way of war, and we're spending lots of money. So let's look at the United States of America. They're spending a Ford-class carrier, $13 billion a copy. And that's before you add sailors and aircraft. So that may be like 16 or 17 or 18 billion after that. The United States is buying five of them. And if you ask any sailor on those aircraft, if there's actually a shooting war in the South China Sea between, China and the United States, they know that they will probably be on the bottom of the South China Sea in 20 minutes because they will be swarmed with hypersonic missiles that they can't defend themselves against. That's a lot of money. The F-35 program, the whole program, is costing U.S. taxpayers and allies like Germany and Finland, $1.7 trillion, which is more money than like Russia's GDP by a lot, on a single-seat airplane that does not go to war. I mean, the U.S. has been at war for 20 years in at least two places, sometimes more. 20 years of war, the F-35 has 0 combat missions. I'm an old paratrooper. There's a saying that dog don't hunt, which means it's useless in modern war. And we're buying more. And the question is, what are the opportunity costs? We're talking trillions of dollars. And it's not just the United States, it's NATO and everybody else. And what are we not buying that we need? So warfare in the 21st century, because we live in a global information age, warfare is becoming more epistemological. Epistemology in philosophy is ask the question, how do you know what you know is real? It's the scientific method comes out of epistemology as one solution based on rationalism and empiricism. But there's many others as well. And that's in an information age, it changes warfare too, where now information can become more powerful than raw firepower, which is the Clausewitzian way of war. Clausewitz's, hit, high utility of force, hit them where they're weakest, that's how you win. Now we're moving to sort of more of a Sun Tzuian paradigm on Sun Tzu's Ancient Art of War, which is, he says, war is all about strategic deception. You win before the first shot is fired. If you're engaging in big open battles like Waterloo, you're not a good general. You want to shape it before it even gets to that point. And that is how you win today. China has something called the three warfare strategy, which is all about media manipulation, psychological operations, and something called lawfare. Russia has long been the disinformation superpower. And the question is, you try to swing close elections by using disinformation. You try to get democracies which are really vulnerable to disinformation to vote for a leader that is better for Russian or Chinese national interest. And the strategic logic is simple. Who cares about how many aircraft carriers they have? Who cares about the sword if you can manipulate the mind that wields it? That's very effective at the strategic level. Unfortunately, most military thinking in NATO is only done at the tactical and operational level. So, like America, they can win wars, like America, they can win battles but lose wars, which is what the U.S. has done in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Winning battles at the tactical operational level, but losing wars because it takes more than tanks to win battles. And the problem is that how does a democracy defend itself against disinformation without slowly becoming an autocracy? Democracies can't engage in censorship and remain a democracy. And this is the weakness of democracies in this new way of warfare. Autocracies can wage this type of war, which I call sneaky war, and it involves a lot of other things. But autocracies can wage sneaky war because they're not vulnerable as much to disinformation. They control the media. They don't care about breaking international law. They do it all the time. They control the levers of industry, of military. They centralize all this power at the Putin level, the Xi Jinping level, and they can become very efficient. Now, there are ways to win against that, and I talk about that elsewhere. But the U.S., EU has to learn how to fight sneaky rather than hard, and we haven't done that yet.
I have only one last question for us. Since we're here at the International Relations Department at Webster, Vienna, could you maybe give some advice for students of international relations? What should they focus on in their studies as a nice way to conclude today?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. So I came to international relations and academia very late in life. It's sort of like my fifth career. I was a paratrooper, I was a private military contractor, I then became a private intelligence guy, which is a different world. I then worked in think tanks and policy and presidential campaigns. But instead of going into the Pentagon as a political appointee, I ended up going to the London School of Economics to do a PhD against the advice of everybody I knew. I was 40 at that age. So my advice, and now I straddle, but my education was really from the field. And what I would recommend is students who are mostly under 30 here, is that, yeah.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, that it's important to read the theory and to get a grounding in where security studies is. And a lot of that is in English, frankly, so I think you need to, work on English or use Google Translate, but also be suspicious of theory. Let's not forget that academic theory, first of all, like the establishments in NATO and Washington, a lot of it is mired in the 20th century. And it doesn't apply to the 21st century always, not cleanly. I mean, remember that theory has two purposes. One is it has to have explanatory power, and one is predictive power. Well, in terms of explanatory power, I think historians are better than security studies in looking at what caused World War I. We can debate that, but I think history it's not the best teacher, but I think it's the only teacher we have rather than theory. The second is that predictive power. None of the 20th century theory that are still read, oldies but goodies, they all failed to predict the end of the Cold War, the rise, the 9/11, the return of ISIS, North Korea getting the bomb. I mean, if you look at their track record, they are worse than chance. Flipping a coin is a better predictor than reading Elliot Cohen, who's a well-known American security studies guy. And so trust your intuition. I was able to easily do that because I had, 20 plus years doing other things involved in security studies, and I would read things and say, well, that's BS. But also it opens my eyes to because there are other young thinkers, youngish thinkers, like under 40, 45, who are saying some very interesting things, and they may not all be in the mainstream, because one of the problems of peer review is good for policing wackadoodles, as we'd say in America, like crazy people, but peer review also, it enforces groupthink. And, you look at tenure for professors, at least in the United States, they have to kiss the ring of famous academics to get tenure, and those famous academics have books that were published in the 1970s and 80s that they want on people's reading lists. So, and they promote people who look like themselves. So if you're truly thinking in a new, innovative way about international relations in the 21st century and how it impacts warfare, it may not be from traditional sources. So read traditional sources. I'm not saying they're bankrupt, but also be open to younger, radical, new thinkers. And then also use professors' connections, develop a relationship. When I was an undergraduate, I was a little too shy, which is remarkable looking back. And that was a real loss. And the way to attract professors' attention is to be brilliant, frankly, and to be a good writer, because you don't know what you know until you write it down. And messy writing is a sign of inchoate thinking. Lastly, I would recommend you can become a professor, but look beyond that as well to working in places where you can shape policy. Whether it's, in the EU, in your capital city, in the military, in the United Nations, someplace else. Multinational corporations as well need this. So your audience is quite broad, and you're going to have to learn how to sell yourself. My last piece of advice is that in at least Washington, D.C., but I also suspect Brussels, that a lot of people get ahead not because they're good, but because they're plausible. And you will have to make a decision at some point, would you rather be plausible or good? Because they both have their pros and cons. If you choose to be good, expect that you are not going to be famous, you're not going to have the influence, but you are good. And if your predictions are good, hopefully you get invited back. If you're plausible, you're more like that politician who's shifting every 2 or 3 years. Some people find that very easy to do. Other people find it soul destroying. So think about that now, because it's an option. I won't say one is honorable, one's dishonorable. They're different, and they're different paths for IR folks. But IR folks have this path which they should recognize. You can be a theorist, you can be a doer, you can do all sorts of different things. Maybe you can even do a little bit of both. But I encourage future Webster students to consider IR, read it critically, and know that you have this choice between influence and power, and they're not always opposite each other, but you may have to choose. And so think about that before you have to choose, rather than at that moment, because we don't always make the best decisions in a snap decision.
Well, thank you very much for this. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.